Here are all the changes I noticed which were made to Rainbow Magic number 1, Ruby the Red Fairy, when it was released in the United States. In the opening illustration, Rock Pools becomes Tide Pools. Orchard is removed. Mrs. Mary's Cottage is added. In the opening poem, Thick Ice Form becomes Thick Ice Forms. Mortal World becomes Human World. Fateful is removed from This Fateful Day. Chapter 1. Towards becomes Toward. Holiday becomes Vacation. And Golden becomes Even Golden. Rock Pools becomes Tide Pools. Here and There becomes Dotted Here and There. Mum becomes Mom. Mum becomes Mom. Rainbow is Far Out to Sea becomes Rainbow Stretched Far Out to Sea. Holiday becomes Vacation. And We're At becomes Oh, We're At. Near each other becomes close to each other. The sea becomes the ocean. The sea looks really deep becomes the ocean looks really deep here. A sea monster becomes a wild sea monster. That big cliff becomes that big white cliff. Turned round becomes turned around. Mum becomes mom. Mum becomes mom. Looked at each other in delight becomes looked at each other and smiled. Mum becomes mom. Looked round becomes looked around. Mum becomes mom. Made her look down becomes made Rachel look down. Waving at her becomes waving. Seaweed lay in piles on the sand becomes piles of seaweed lay on the sand. Dotted about becomes sprinkled everywhere. Fairy stories becomes fairy tales. We can becomes maybe we can. A lane becomes a road. Towards a small wood becomes toward a small stretch of woods. The wood was becomes the woods were. Cool and green becomes cool and shady. After the heat becomes after being in the heat. Then they both becomes then both girls. The sentence, its colors sparkled and twinkled brightly, is added before the last sentence of the chapter. Chapter 2. Move just a little becomes moved, but just a little. We must becomes we have to. Turn the pot over becomes turn the pot over somehow. Nearly there becomes almost there. The sentence starting with Rachel and Kirsty watched is split into two sentences at the words her delicate. Sparkling becomes sparkled. Chapter 3. Rachel and Kirsty's heads becomes Rachel's and Kirsty's heads. Hair was plaited becomes hair was braided. Her little feet wore crimson slippers becomes she wore crimson slippers on her little feet. She waved becomes the fairy waved. The shower becomes a shower. Where it landed becomes where the dust landed. All sorts becomes all kinds. It really and truly becomes this really and truly. Tiny silvery voice becomes tiny voice. Saffron becomes sunny. Izzy becomes inky. Chapter 4. She danced becomes the fairy danced. She flew becomes Ruby flew. At once becomes all at once. Picture appeared becomes picture appeared in the water. A river of brightest blue becomes a river of the brightest blue. Clouds floating past becomes clouds that floated past. Some were flying becomes others were flying. Goblins, elves, imps, and pixies becomes goblins, elves, and pixies. Pointed down becomes pointed, to a spot becomes at a spot. Each dressed prettily in their own rainbow color becomes each dressed prettily in her own rainbow color. To the sound of tinkling music is moved from the start of the sentence to the end. Stepped out becomes stepped through the doors. Golden coat and golden crown becomes golden coat and crown. Fairies, he began, becomes fairies and friends, he began. Frogs in smart orange outfits becomes frogs in purple suits. Started to play becomes started to play their instruments. Seemed to fill the room becomes filled the room. And allowed becomes then allowed. There was frost becomes there were tiny icicles. Icicles hung from his clothes is removed. And she shivered becomes she shivered. She shivered as well becomes she shivered too. Jack Frost glared becomes in the watery picture Jack Frost glared. Ruby looked up from the pond picture. She smiled sadly becomes Ruby looked up and smiled sadly. And looked back at the pond is added after she said. The Fairy Queen becomes they watched as the Fairy Queen. You are very welcome becomes you are more than welcome. Well, you will not becomes you will not. Mortal world becomes human world. Chapter 5. The first sentence is split into two sentences after the word spell. As becomes as Rachel and Kirsty kept watching the pond's surface. The other fairies watched becomes the other fairies could only watch. Trapped, never to return, becomes trapped far away. They will be all alone and they will never return. He left becomes he walked away. Leaving a trail becomes leaving only a trail. Trail of icy footprints becomes trail of icy footprints behind. Jack Frost's magic is very powerful is added to the start of the Queen's first sentence. I cannot undo Jack Frost's magic becomes I cannot undo it. To a safe place becomes to a place where they will be safe. Until they are rescued becomes until they can be rescued. Towards becomes toward. Pot becomes may this pot safely together becomes together and safe. The pot flew becomes as Rachel, Kirsty, and Ruby watched, the pot flew. Behind a dark cloud becomes its own sentence, which reads, it disappeared behind a dark cloud. Until it looked becomes until the beautiful land. All the color is gone is added after Kirsty gasped. The picture in the pond becomes the image in the pond. Rain spell becomes Rainspell Island. Rachel's statement is turned into a question, which makes sense as the text says she was bursting with questions. Jack Frost's spell must have been stronger than the Queen thought becomes Jack Frost's magic was very strong. As the pot spun through the sky, it split off into its own sentence and it swaps places with the wind blew my sisters out again. The wind blew my sisters out again becomes the wind from his spell blew my sisters right out of the pot. As the pot spun through the sky becomes we were still spinning through the sky. And all at once they were gone is added to the text. Ruby shook her head is added to the text. In the dark I was frightened and alone. My fairy magic wouldn't even work is added to the text. There's a lot of changes all made to the paragraph starting with Ruby looked upset. They're scattered becomes I think they're scattered. Jack Frost's becomes I'm sure Jack Frost's. As well becomes two. Then becomes once we're together. We can all becomes we can. Chapter 6. Nor could Rachel is deleted. We'll fly there becomes we'll fly. Whirled up into the air and flew over the girls' heads becomes whirled up into the air over the girls' heads. Seemed like trees becomes seemed as big as trees. Twisted round becomes twisted around. She felt herself rise becomes she rose herself. Is very odd becomes flying was not at all like walking. Glade becomes meadow. From the air is added before Rachel looked down. No mortal becomes no human. After Ruby says we're here, she says these two sentences. Luckily, while we're in fairyland, no time passes in your world. No one will even know you were gone. The river and flowers becomes the river. Even the air felt cold and damp is removed. Could be bothered becomes had the energy. Towards the river becomes toward. Circled around them becomes circled around Ruby. Everywhere else becomes everything else. Mortals becomes humans. These are my friends becomes these are my new friends. Rachel wanted to know becomes Rachel asked. Holiday becomes vacation. Holiday becomes vacation. They flew off becomes they all flew off together. As they got becomes but as they got. Further away becomes farther away. They reached becomes the three girls reached. Wood becomes woods. Her wings had gone becomes her wings were gone. If I try, I might fade away completely is added before, so I will wait for you. That is 150 changes to this 65-page book, or 2.3 changes per page.